Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Ream Library. It's good to see Ream full and everyone out today. My name is Tom Lenny. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the college. The McFarland Center sponsors lectures, conferences, all sorts of special events on campus that relate to issues of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. There's hardly more pressing a topic than to talk about what many scientists, political leaders, and Pope Francis consider one of the greatest existential threats to humanity, climate change. Today's lecture continues a year-long focus that we've had on climate change. Before this semester, first-year students read The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells. A number of us faculty and others have talked about that in fishbowl conversations and fishbowls with students, exploring the claims and challenges laid out in the book. We also heard from Erica Spanger-Siegfried of the Union of Concerned Scientists on the future of dangerously hot days that we're facing. And if you missed those events, you can find video of both of them online at holycross.edu/McFarland Center, as you will in a couple days be able to find video of this talk, so you can tell your friends who didn't come that they can find this online in a couple of days. If you go to McFarland Center, just click on Listen and Learn. This semester, we turned our focus to political solutions to climate change. So today, Thea Riofrancos of Providence College will argue for a new Green Deal. On March 31st at 7 p.m., which is a different date than we originally advertised, the other was supposed to be this week, but we had to switch the date, Professor Jody Freeman of Harvard Law School, constitutional law, environmental law scholar and former Obama advisor, will talk about what she believes is necessary and achievable to reset the course on climate policy. That talk will be recorded and on our site as well, but I know you'll all want to come in person. Thea Riofrancos is assistant professor of political science at Providence College. Her research focuses on resource extraction, renewable energy, climate change, green technology, social movements, and the left in Latin America. These themes are explored in a forthcoming book, Resource Radicals: From Petronationalism to Petro-Extractivism in Ecuador. She's co-author of A Planet to Win: Why We Need the Green New Deal, published just last year. And she's penned peer-reviewed articles for Perspectives on Politics, Cultural Studies, and World Politics. Previously, she was a visiting fellow at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at the University of Notre Dame and held a one-year appointment as a visiting scholar on the Facultad de Ciencias Sociales in Quito, Ecuador. Please join me in welcoming Thea Riofrancos.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, everybody. This is such an amazing turnout. I hear that these events do well in terms of student and professor engagement, so that's awesome. Wonderful to see a full room. So today I'm going to be talking about the Green New Deal. And I'm going to make this argument. This is like the capsule of my argument, that a Green New Deal is necessary for climate safety, meaning a planet that is livable for humans and for other species, but also for social justice. And I'm going to also argue that those are connected. They're not like two different goals, they're the same goal. So that's like the big overview of what I'll be talking about today. It already was held up, so now this feels redundant and like a little bit shameless self-promotion, but just so you know that the arguments that I'm making today aren't just my own. They're arguments that a whole community of scholars and activists are making, but also specifically that 4 of us made in a book that just came out last November that you can pick up. It's quite inexpensive and readable. I think it's like a weekend read. So if you're interested in what I have to say, check that out. But let me start with some basic definitions. I don't like to assume that anyone knows what anything is when I walk into a classroom or an event, and I think it's good to sort of get on the same page about what things mean. So what is the Green New Deal? We've probably heard, hopefully at least some of us, maybe many of us have heard the term before, but that doesn't mean that we know what it means, right? The basics of what the Green New Deal are is that it's a framework or a paradigm for how to address the climate crisis. But what's unique about the Green New Deal, because there's a lot of climate policies out there, there's been climate policies that have been attempted, that have succeeded, that have not succeeded, right? So what's unique about the Green New Deal is that, as I said at the outset, it connects inequality to the climate crisis. It says that the way that we deal with the climate crisis is by treating these two big issues of our time at the same time. And it's also kind of a comment on the state of the world today, that there are two major crises facing the world. There's like a billion terrible things in the world, but if we had to put them into two big categories, one would be the climate crisis, and the second would be what we might call a crisis of social and economic inequality. We see that domestically, but it's also global in its scope. And this connection between these two big crises of inequality and of climate change are a connection that that climate activists have made for a long time, right? So climate justice and environmental justice activists have always seen the connections between these two phenomena. Fortunately, policymakers and other experts are starting to catch up and see how deeply imbricated they are. So that's one piece. The second piece, second bullet point there, is that the Green New Deal sees the climate crisis and the social crisis as very urgent, as things that we have to deal with right away. In the next decade, I'll get to that more in a moment, like within the next decade, we have to do a lot. So that's a pretty like approximate timeline, right? But also something that we have to address at the right scale. The climate crisis is something that, as I'm gonna show, affects every aspect of our lives and is also caused by every aspect in our lives, right? So it's a very deep-seated issue, and that means that we need to address it at the scale of the crisis. So those are basically the two main propositions of the Green New Deal. And now I'm going to get into some evidence. So what in the following kind of few slides and several minutes of the talk, just so you have a little preview, I'm going to offer some scientific evidence based in the climate science for why I think a Green New Deal is the best way to address the climate crisis. And then I'm going to give you some political evidence, right? So I was introduced as a political scientist, which I am. I'm not a climate scientist, though I read it, but I'm a political scientist, right? So I also think about, what's politically feasible. And maybe contrary to some expectations in the room, I'd actually argue that the Green New Deal is the most politically feasible climate policy. It's also very ambitious, but it's also very feasible in terms of building political coalitions, winning votes, doing all the things we need to do in a democracy, ostensibly, to get things done. But first, let me start with the science. First of all, we know from the climate science, but we also know from the news, and we also might potentially know from our personal experience, that the climate crisis is already happening. Meaning the climate crisis is not like a future problem. It's a right now problem. It's a yesterday problem. It's been going on for a while now, and it's intensifying every day. And the climate models are getting more sophisticated and getting more sort of apocalyptic, we might say, getting more dramatic in their conclusions. So what that means for policy is that we need something that starts now and that is like pretty comprehensive, because the climate crisis, again, is not something we're trying to avoid in the future. It's something that we're trying to adapt, be more resilient to, and mitigate in the present. So that's one thing. And what are some signs of that? Again, some of these we've experienced perhaps firsthand, or at least, in the news media, which is, the rapid warming of temperatures. I mean, just go outside right now. This is not normal February in New England. I'm 36, and like in my lifetime, it's very obvious that temperatures have gotten warmer and also more erratic. Like, I don't know, I live in Providence, I assume it's similar. Like yesterday it was 20 degrees, today it's like 50 degrees. Who even knows what will be tomorrow, right? So we have these erratic and warmer temperatures. We have sea level rise. We have a lot of like extreme weather events like storms, tornadoes, things like that. We also have some larger scale macro events that might be harder for some of us to observe, but that we know are happening. So we have desertification, desert, meaning things are getting, oops, I just turned it off. There we go. Things are getting drier, which is a big problem in already dry parts of the world, and so agriculture is becoming difficult. We have what scientists refer to as the sixth mass species extinction. So there have been extinctions in the past, right, like the dinosaurs. So it's not like the first extinction, but it's the sixth one, and it's a major one. Lots of species are dying off. We'll never see them again. In fact, species are dying so fast that there are species that we haven't cataloged yet, especially insects, that are going to be dead before we ever catalog them. Extinct, before we ever catalog them. We have massive deforestation, ocean acidification. I mean, these are just, might be scientific jargon to some of us. So, but just to give you a sense, like it's very, the scope and the depth of the climate crisis are quite severe, and it sounds like other speakers have spoken to that. But the other thing is that there's a big difference for human societies all over the earth, including in the US. There's a big difference between aiming for 1.5 degree Celsius above industrial level warming, industrial revolution level, kind of what the temperatures were at that moment of history, versus 2 degrees. And the reason I say this, which, some of this might make sense to some of us, some of us don't know what I'm talking about, but basically scientists map out what would happen to ecosystems, but also to human societies if we have 1.5 degrees Celsius above the Industrial Revolution era temperatures on Earth. What would happen if we have 2 degrees? What would happen if we have 3, 4, 5, 8? It gets pretty serious, right? And it turns out, according to the latest kind of UN research, the IPCC report that was published last year, and I'll refer to a couple of times, that it's a dramatic difference. It sounds so little, 0.5 degrees Celsius. Who cares? No one. But actually, that difference, that window of difference, is catastrophic. It means millions of more people die, just to put it extremely bluntly, because it turns out that the climate crisis causes death because of the public health issues that it unleashes. So the science tells us the climate crisis is already happening. It's very severe. It's multifaceted, and minor differences in temperature cause major differences in outcomes, right? So that's just the summary of what I just said. And the upshot of all of this is that we have 1 decade. We're in 2020, so let's just think. We have until 2030, right, to cut global carbon emissions in half to avoid catastrophic global warming. We already have global warming, but it's going to get a lot worse unless we do something about it in the next 10 years. And the thing that we need to do is cut global emissions in half, a really big task, right? And I'll say, and this will become again clearer in a moment, that means that countries in what we call the global north, which are the advanced industrialized economies of the world, like the US, need to actually act faster than some other countries, because there are other countries that don't have the means to actually decarbonize that quickly. So a decade to cut global carbon emissions in half, with the global north, with the US, the UK, Western Europe, Japan, et cetera, in the lead. So that's a big task. Now I want to get into, I've sort of laid out a little of the climate science and what the climate scientists are telling us that we need to do. Now I want to get into the social science, the political science, sociology, history kind of piece of this, which is how is the climate crisis related to the way that our societies are structured? And, I'm a visual person, so I a lot of what my slides are actually going to be photographs. There'll be some bullet points, but, here are some images that give you a sense of how deeply unequal carbon emissions are, and the vulnerability to carbon emissions, and I'll get to that in a moment. But what the first slides are basically telling us on the left-hand side is that the wealthiest 10% of humanity, not just in the US, everywhere, are responsible for over 50%, 10% people, 50% of lifestyle-related emissions, the emissions that come about from our driving, from our shopping, from our, if we're so lucky, private jets, that sort of thing, right? So all lifestyle-related emissions, 10% of humanity responsible for over 50% of them. Then on the right-hand side, we see that countries that we would consider the most economically developed and the wealthiest today are responsible for the vast majority of historic emissions. And those are not history. Those emissions are what is currently causing the climate crisis, right? Because emissions accumulate over time, and atmospheric temperature changes over time. And so those historic emissions are actually quite important. In addition, the US is still the largest per capita emitter, right? China's a big emitter, but if you divide by population, the US is the largest, has twice as high per capita emissions as China. So that's to give you a sense of how inequality and emissions are related, who's culpable and who's responsible for those emissions. Another way to think about inequality and emissions is to think about private firms, right? So when we move to all emissions, not just lifestyle related, but all emissions, 71% of those emissions are really caused by a handful of global corporations, primarily fossil fuel, petrochemical corporations, right, who make a living by extracting and selling oil, coal, and natural gas around the world, right? And so those companies, we can trace to those companies' activities 71% of global emissions overall. So that's another way to think about inequality, right? Because most of us are not CEOs of these major firms, so when we think about responsibility, this is one way to think about it. Then the flip side of that is that the most vulnerable people on Earth, including in the US, but also especially especially when we think globally, especially when we think about low-income areas of the world, are the least well off. So the people that are already feeling the effects of the climate crisis are those who have the least and fewest resources to deal with it. So those are just two sides of the same coin in terms of inequality and the climate crisis. And depending what classes we've taken in this room, and I'm thinking about the students, but including professors, like what we've taught and what we've learned about the world, you may have a sense that, there's also like a historical relationship being depicted here in terms of, legacies of imperialism, of colonialism, of inequality, right, that are actually today being reflected in both causality and vulnerability to climate change, right? So this is not just something that happened yesterday. This is something rooted in some longer historical relationships. It also, to bring it back sort of to the US and to the neighborhoods and places that we live in, this kind of unequal relationship between who produces the carbon emissions and who is vulnerable to the effects of them is reproduced in the neighborhoods we live in, right? So if you actually do like carbon mapping and heat mapping and carbon footprint mapping, which scientists do, the most affluent areas generate the most emissions because their lifestyles are very carbon intensive, right? The lifestyles of the rich and famous involve owning jet planes and ordering food in and ordering things from around the world whenever you want, and all of that right now, given the energy system, means a lot of fossil fuel emissions. So where does the Green New Deal fit into this? Well, actually, I'll get there in a moment. I'm going to you can ignore this for now. I'm going to just speak at you for a moment without something behind me. But the Green New Deal basically says, as I said at the beginning, that because inequality and the climate crisis are so deeply related, right, we need to attack them at the same time. And the insight here is that an actually pragmatic way to create lower carbon societies that don't produce as much carbon, that don't destroy the earth as rapaciously as ours does and as the kind of global societies does, is to make them more egalitarian. That actually making our societies more equal is a key part of the puzzle into making them less carbon intensive. And so that's the kind of gambit of the Green New Deal. And so when we see, and I'll get into some of the policies a little bit later in the talk, but just to preview, when we see policies that relate to building denser, more affordable housing, right, that is also more energy efficient, that is located near mass transit, right, that changing the types of recreational activities that we do, right, instead of shopping, maybe we go to a park, maybe we take a hike, right, maybe we spend time with friends. All of this way to like totally reimagine society will make it more equal and maybe more pleasurable in terms of our daily lives, because we won't be so stressed about rent, how to pay rent, and how to make ends meet, and also can make it lower carbon at the same time. That there are a lot of policy interventions that do both of those at once. And this can sound like very far-reaching, right? Like I'm basically going to argue today that we need to deeply restructure the way that we live our daily lives, not because we make different choices, but because public policy will actually reshape our built environment. So that's an argument that I'm going to make today, and that sounds like extremely ambitious. But I just want to note something that the climate scientists tell us. So this is back to our climate scientists. The IPCC report, which received a lot of fanfare when it was published last year, actually now a year and a half ago or so in 2018, says, and I'm quoting from them, that in order to stay within the bounds of climate safety, in order to be hovering around 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels of temperature, in order to do that, we need, quote, rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all of society. Rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented. Those are climate scientists. They are not communists. I mean, like, meaning they're not necessarily political radicals, but they're looking at the situation and they're saying in order to avoid the worst outcomes that are quite foreseeable, because they're already happening, unevenly around the world, we need to transform our societies. And that's what the Green New Deal is going to do, or what I'm going to argue that we should do through a Green New Deal. And what does rapid and far-reaching mean? So it means that, it would be so simple if the only thing we needed to do to avoid catastrophic global warming was trade out oil and gas and coal for solar and wind. I mean, that's a big ask in and of itself, and we absolutely need to do that 100%. We need to use renewable energy and clean energy. But but it actually is going to take a little more than that, right? Because it turns out a lot of aspects of our lives are pretty destructive to the environment, of the way we've organized our society. So I'm not blaming any individual person in this room or myself, but it's our kind of social organization. So we need to live closer together. We need to travel less in cars, right? We need to have less sprawl. And we might even need to change the way that we consume things. So those are the kinds of changes that we're imagining. And these are enormous, enormous changes to our society, because in the US, we have a particularly car-dependent, consumer-dependent, single, detached homes that are far away from one another and far away from where we work type of society. And that's the type of society that generates a lot of emissions. And all of this kind of is to say that we are going to need a lot of resources and money to change the way that our society is organized from the ground up in ways that would actually change our daily lives quite dramatically if we were to do it all. And the question is, like, who's going to pay for all this? Where is this investment going to come from? Who's going to foot the bill? And who's going to, kind of make the decisions around how to change our daily lives so that we're spewing less carbon into the air? And the argument of the Green New Deal, and my argument today, is that we shouldn't sit around and wait for either individuals, like just us in this room as individuals, or for the private sector, as dynamic as it might be in certain ways, to make this change for us. That we actually need the public sector to step in and government to take a large role, which does not mean the state owns everything. That's not what I'm going to argue for today. But it does mean that just like with the Great Depression, just like with World War II, there are crises that are public in nature, that are social in nature, that require a collective response, and that we're not going to wait around and see if like private firms are going to get us out of the Great Depression. We're not going to wait around and see if private firms decide to produce the type of weapons we need to fight fascists and during World War II. As a government and as a people, we're actually going to take that decision collectively and direct public investment and hopefully incentivize private investment too to meet the challenge, right? And so the types of changes that I've mentioned, to housing, to urban planning, to what type of jobs we do, to where we get our energy sources from, I will argue need to be made by the government in a democratic fashion. But we're not going to wait for the private sector to do this, because there's zero negative evidence that they're up to the task. In fact, every economist predicts that like in a year or so we're going to have another recession, right? So we're already in a sort of low growth, stagnant economy situation, and we're going to have a recession, and that's really not going to be a moment where the private sector decides to massively invest in green energy, to build dense affordable housing, to build mass transit, or to do any of those things. And several of those things, just for what it's worth for the economists or social scientists in the room, are by their nature public goods. So they're not the types of things that the private sector has historically built on its own. So I want to talk a little bit now about this slide that I erroneously went to too quickly before, which is the politics of all this. So I'm suggesting that we make some huge changes. I'm going to zoom in a little later in the talk specifically about building green, sustainable, affordable housing, right? So that's going to be one of my examples later. But we need more affordable housing. We need mass transit, so we don't always, I drove here from Providence. I would have loved to have sit in the train and read a book instead of like being stressed out on the highway, right? And so we need to actually create these options through government spending and through regulation. But the question is, like, how do we politically get there? Because it seems like a big task for government at a moment where actually a lot of people have low faith in government, right? A lot of people are discontent with politics. And so like how are we actually going to generate this kind of political change? And so in this vein, I want to argue that the Green New Deal is not just a strategy to deal with climate change, it's also a political strategy. And what I mean by that is that it's through the types of policies that the Green New Deal promotes or advocates for that we can actually build a mass coalition to address the climate crisis. And what we know from the kind of history of climate politics, the recent history, in fact, the history during which all of us have been alive and paying attention, is that climate politics can be really hard to get people interested in. In fact, I'm, again, so happy to see so many folks in the room, standing room only in the back, like this is awesome. But historically, including myself, someone who's a political scientist, a professor that focuses on environmental politics, I found climate policy to be arcane, technocratic, difficult, too scientific, do I understand it, whatever, right? And that sort of thing. And most everyday people feel that way if you talk to them just in the abstract about climate policy. And it also turns out that when climate policies don't address people's needs, their material needs, they're very unpopular. So I don't know how many people in the room were following this over the past couple of years, but there was this movement in France, a social movement, called the Yellow Vest movement. My French pronunciation is terrible, so I won't attempt to say it in French, but anyway, in English it's the Yellow Vest movement because they wore these yellow kind of like traffic vest things. And the reason that this movement coalesced is because the Macron government in France attempted to implement a tax that would tax everybody's use of gasoline, like the gas that you used to fill your car. And, sounds like it could be a good policy. It's going to incentivize people to use public transit instead of driving everywhere, incentivize people to carpool. Like, in theory, it sounds okay. But in practice, it's terrible because most people in rural and suburban France, just like most people in rural and suburban America, do not have an alternative to their car. And who are the people that really need to drive their car every day? Working people, people that are driving to work. And so basically you were like working people who, as several slides back I indicated, are not the cause of the climate crisis. You're taxing them and punishing them in their attempt to just make a living. And so there was a big backlash against it, right? And so this is very reasonable from my perspective. Even though the policy is reasonable, the response is also reasonable, right? Because if I were like a struggling person with a kind of old car that wasn't very fuel efficient, just trying to make ends meet with my 2 jobs and picking up my kids from school, and the government was taxing me for a crisis that's been caused over hundreds of years of human activity and primarily by a small elite, I would be pissed off too, right? And so it's not a politically smart policy to just treat everyone equally and to just tax people out of the problem. Not that I'm against carbon taxes, I think they can be done well, but that one wasn't. So the flip side to this, though, is more optimistic and more positive, which is if we design climate policies that simultaneously mitigate emissions and address people's very pressing concerns around rent being too high, around economic insecurity, around it's hard to find a well-paying job type of thing. If you do both of those at once, you build a coalition of people that support climate policy, right? And so the trick is to do those at the same time. And I think that sort of basically summarizes what I wanted to say here. The last thing about new coalitions, and I have a couple slides on public support and polling, is that the type of people that cared a lot about climate policy in the past were who? Scientists, some kind of very enlightened policymakers, and climate activists, people already involved in the issue. But what was always hard about climate policy was to get more people engaged, right? To actually have policies that spoke to ordinary people where they're at. And so what the Green New Deal does is say, everything that we do is connected to the climate crisis, like how we live, what we eat, everything, how we get places. And so when we address the climate crisis, we will actually speak to ordinary people's everyday lives and concerns in language that it makes much more sense to them. And it turns out, it turns out that this is actually a politically winning strategy. I mean, even the fact that it's as salient in the media as it is, I think speaks to its popularity, but it's also nice to have numbers. And as a political scientist, I'm going to put up some opinion polls here, and this is a great outfit that I'm starting to do some work with called Data for Progress that has done a lot of polling around the Green New Deal in particular, and they show that it's super popular among Democrats, which is great. It's polarized, so it's less popular among Republicans, but overall it's reasonably popular. And you have to take into account the fact that, I don't know if folks in the room watch Fox News ever, but during the sort of months where the Green New Deal was a big, it's still a big news item, but during the months after Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sort of released her resolution, Fox News was daily, all they talked about was the Green New Deal. So a lot of Republican voters, even if as individuals they would actually support it, because when you ask people, do you support clean energy, even if they're a Republican voter, they say yes, right? So, but they're very convinced by Fox that the Green New Deal is state socialism. So I think if the media narrative would change for those people, a lot of them would support it too. But it's very impressive that 70% of Democrats support it. And this was at the time when it was released, so it's probably more now that more people have heard of it. And then this is the one, as again, a political scientist, that I find super interesting. They did a poll, and I sort of highlighted the relevant portion there, where they even asked the question about taxes. And if you know anything about American political culture, you know that Americans are very tax adverse, right? And they don't like the idea of increasing taxes. But it turns out that even with what we would consider like a framing that's probably the most negative for the American public to actually say taxes will be raised to pay for this, people, not a majority, but like much more than I would expect, support it despite that, right? And then it gets higher if you emphasize that it would be progressive taxation and, you know, wealthy people would pay more in X, Y, and Z. Okay, so what I want to talk about now, and let me see how I'm doing for time. Okay, we're good. We're good. There's gonna be a lot of time for Q&A. Will there be Q&A? Excellent. I love Q&A, so I actually like to leave more time for that than to just talk at you forever. But there's a couple more things I wanna go over before I wrap up. So I wanna give you a policy example, because I think it'll make it a little bit more concrete for all of us. And one of the policy examples that I'm most enthusiastic about that is already something on the table is green social housing, or that's kind of a European term that's becoming more popular in the US. We could think of it as green public housing. We could think of it as green affordable housing. I don't care. Those are all the same for my purposes. So housing that is affordable to everyday ordinary people, but also is energy efficient, and maybe even beyond energy efficient. Maybe there's like a daycare center there, right? Maybe there's a community center. Maybe you won't have to drive to go everywhere. Maybe some of the services that we all need to live our daily lives are embedded in our housing, right? So there's some really, you can just look up on Google Images, there's some beautiful pictures of what this might look like. There are places in Europe, in Canada that already have this sort of housing, and we're beginning to see policy movement towards generating it in the US. So I'll give you just a couple of examples of legislation. Again, political science, but I think it's useful to think of it as like a politically concrete thing. One is that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC for short, and Bernie Sanders have co-sponsored a bill called Green Retrofits for Public Housing. What's a retrofit? That might be a word some of us know, some of us don't know, but basically if you have a building that's not very green, it produces a lot of emissions as it is, and it's very energy inefficient. Retrofit just basically kind of makes improvements to that building in order to make it more energy efficient, right? One thing to think about, which I meant to mention earlier, is that buildings, like the one we're in, are a big source of emissions, major. They can be like 20 to 40% or more, depending on the city. Why are they such a big source? Because all of our heating, cooling, gas, if we're cooking, gets routed through our buildings. And all of those are fossil fuels right now. And so all of those emissions kind of are routed through our built environment, like our buildings. In addition that, you know, this looks fancy and new, but like in a lot of New England, like the home that I live in is like from the Victorian age or something. And like it's just leaking, like I'm just paying National Grid to like not heat my home, basically, right? And don't get me started on National Grid. That can be for the Q&A. But anyway, point being that, that buildings are a great like physical site to intervene and reduce emissions, right? And the other thing that we might know about housing is there's a housing crisis in the US. There's a lack of affordable housing, and also there's a crisis of homelessness, right? And the homelessness crisis is a result of the housing crisis, meaning it's not like people just decide to become homeless, people become homeless, and increasingly this is the case because they can't afford housing. So some of the places where you have the most homelessness, New York City, LA, Bay Area, are places where rents are just like astronomically increasing. And a lot of homeless people, in addition to vets, who are a big portion of the homeless population, but a lot of homeless people are first-time homeless people, and they're working people. Like they are people that have jobs but can't afford the rent, right? So we have the climate crisis and we have the housing crisis, right? We also have a crisis with jobs. Our unemployment rates are okay right now, but a lot of us, maybe not in this room depending, a lot of us are students, maybe not working multiple jobs, so some of us might be, but a lot of working people work multiple jobs, right? So they can't afford to make ends meet with the high rents with just one job. And so what I love about green public or affordable housing is it attacks all those things at once. And I'll just put a slide up and, oops, I keep clicking my computer instead of this thing. And so what it does is the first bullet point. I just created this idea today, the trifecta, which is like, it does three things at once. So if you say, we're gonna retrofit, we're gonna improve, weatherize, whatever your preferred term is, all of the existing public housing stock in this city, what do? You reduce emissions, because anytime you do green retrofits to a home, like let's say you swap out the gas stove for electric induction stoves, anytime you do something like that, you reduce emissions. You also reduce inequality, because a major driver of inequality is the high cost of housing. And you help solve the homelessness crisis, which is also part of our crisis of inequality in this country. And then the third thing you do is you create a lot of jobs. Why? Because retrofitting a home requires construction. It requires the buildings trades, right? It requires people that do carpentry and install things. And those tend to actually be good jobs, union jobs, relatively dignified jobs. So you create a lot of jobs, you reduce homelessness and housing insecurity, and you reduce emissions with one policy intervention, right? So this is the type of policy, and there's another one with Representative Ilhan Omar, who wants to straight up build like millions of new green affordable housing units across the country. Many would be public housing, but not exclusively. So there's a few different proposals out there, but you kind of achieve three things at once, which I think is the genius of the Green New Deal, right? And then the second thing, just in terms of the politics of that, is you create what we might think of as a positive feedback loop between the policy and political support for it. Why? Because, what better way to generate and shore up constituents for climate action? A historically difficult policy area to get people excited about. What better way to do that than to create a lot of jobs? All those people are now your voters, right? Anyone they owe their job to you will probably vote for you, A. And all those housing, residents, all those people that benefited from the affordable green housing, and maybe beyond that, maybe the neighborhood begins to flourish, right? Maybe other people kind of experience subsidiary benefits of it. So you create a constituency, a political constituency. Why is it so hard for, no matter how many times they've tried, Republicans really have not been able to privatize Social Security or dramatically reduce its benefits? Why? Because you have an enormous constituency of older Americans who are Social Security voters. Like, whether they're Republican or Democrat, they will not vote for someone that cuts their lifeline. My parents both depend on Social Security, for most of their income, right? My parents are never going to vote for anybody that is going to cut that. It's the same thing with these types of policies. When you have really concrete policies that people can understand the benefits of in their daily lives, and they can draw the cause and effect, like I voted you in, you put this in, now I have a job, a better place to live, you create a feedback loop where then those people might be more open to even more transformative climate policies, right? And so we want to kind of generate those feedback loops. Up until this kind of era, we've been in a negative feedback loop with climate policy. All people see are the costs and the technocratic, wonky, whatever, I don't understand this, and they're not going to vote for it. On top of that, the fossil fuel industry, which I haven't talked about enough today, but I'll just say now, are like such an impediment because they lobby against everything. So you have, again, up until the Green New Deal, there was like a negative feedback loop between policy and the sort of like politics of building a constituency. All right, so I'm going to just bring up, I think that I'm just going to take a few more minutes and I just make kind of a couple of more points, and then I'll bring us to Q&A. So one is like, what can we do now? Right? We are in a political moment. I don't want to assume anything about the politics of anyone in the room, but I'll just say sort of objectively that we're in a political moment where climate, like Green New Deal or any climate policy, is totally impossible at the federal level. We have an administration, and it's not just because they're Republican, it's also because of some of their particular beliefs about climate change or lack thereof, that they are not going to be open to any climate action at the federal level. So this can feel a little depressing. Like, what do we do? Do we just wait? I would say, like, get involved in politics, elect someone better next time. But, for the time being, what do we do? And I'm going to kind of just bring up two kind of quick examples, two quick proposals of what I think we can do. One is local and state politics are very important. Emissions don't care at what level of government they're generated, right? So like everything that we do, as I've tried to argue, can generate emissions or not, or mitigate it, right? And so that means that actually local politics, state politics are important here. And one of the benefits of a federal system, which has its downsides, but one of its benefits is that we have subnational decision making in the US, meaning we don't have to only wait for the national government to do something. We can enact things in our towns, in our municipalities, in our counties, in our states. We have a lot of levers of decision making in the US, and we should use all of those. New York City recently passed an extremely stringent bill that's going to cut, I just don't want to misquote it, so let me look at the number, 80% of emissions from buildings by 2050. 80%, that's a lot, it's like almost 100, right? So they're going to really dramatically cut emissions from buildings, because New York City is one of those cities where a lot of the emissions come from buildings or are routed through them. How do they do this? It's kind of amazing, because guess who was their number one opponent? The real estate lobby. If anyone knows anything about New York City, I'm from New York City, but you don't have to be from there. It's like a very expensive, affluent place. The real estate lobby is extremely powerful in New York City. It's like one of the most powerful political actors at the city and state level, and for a long time, they've unfortunately had a lot of politicians in their pocket. But that's changed because some more progressive, independent kind of politicians have been elected, and also a movement around that connects climate justice to housing justice has been created in New York City, and that was enough to overcome this resistance. They lobbied against it, like every day. They lobbied. They went, to the city council and lobbied against it, but it didn't work. And so city council passed that. And then New York State, with some similar changes, like some more progressive people in office, a little more independent of the sort of big money donations, has passed the country's most ambitious climate plan. #1, like better than California. It's pretty amazing. Carbon-free electricity by 2040 and a net zero carbon economy, every sector, by 2050. Most ambitious climate plan right now. And they passed that over some, again, some pretty intransigent opposition. And so there's a lot that we can do locally and at the state level. And that sort of points to my second thing that we can do while Trump is in office and we have this sort of blockage at the federal level, which is social mobilization and political engagement, right? The reason that those bills passed in New York City and New York State is because people got involved in politics. People showed up. People went to those hearings that might be boring sometimes, right? And they pressed for their issues. And I think that we're actually in a moment. I'm 36 right now, and I'm only mentioning that to say that I've been a political scientist for several years, but I've been an activist for much longer, right? So I first got involved in activism on various issues when I was around 16, so almost 20 years. And I've actually, will tell you now, as much as it sometimes feels depressing, the climate crisis and the state of politics in this country, I've never been more optimistic because, and it's not just my anecdotal experience, so some of it's that, it's also I read the research on social movements and I read the research on social mobilization, and we're actually at a relatively high point in US history. Maybe we're not quite comparable to the 60s yet, but we're getting there in terms of the level and degree of social movements, right? And so we can go all the way back to Occupy Wall Street, a little, far, I'm not sure, again, the age in the room, but that might feel far away or maybe early in our political consciousness, but I would sort of start the cycle then, and other scholars have sort of periodized it that way. We think about Black Lives Matter, we can think about Standing Rock, but also, I don't know if folks have been reading this in the past couple of years, a lot of labor strikes, which is something that historically has been low in recent decades in the US, but teachers are going on strike, nurses are going on strike, and that's created new forms of political pressure and advocacy. So I would say that social mobilization is very important, and it's not just symbolic. It also is having consequences. So for example, lots of politicians are being pressured to not take money from fossil fuels. From fossil fuel, corporations, or if they do, they're being sort of shamed about it, right? The Democratic Party agreed under a lot of pressure from the Sunrise Movement. I had a photograph of them earlier. They're a big youth climate movement. They agreed under pressure for them to hold a climate town hall. They've never done that before. They didn't do a whole debate, which is what they wanted, but it was a pretty good second kind of plan B. And so you have kind of activists putting demonstrable pressure on some big institutions in society, like the Democratic Party, and on individual politicians. And so I think you sort of, in the lead up to the next election, both the local and state policies that are being enacted in many places in the US and the kind of social mobilization are good kind of inputs into hopefully what could be a different administration in the future, both because social mobilization is important to kind of pressure politicians, and then the local and state stuff provides examples of what good policies could look like. And I want to kind of just end, and now I'll take us to, I think this should be my last slide. Yes, pretty pictures. Okay. So I'm just going to end on what I personally find the most inspiring about the Green New Deal. I've said a lot at you today, a lot of things that I like about this policy. I've said it's in line with the climate science. I've said it's politically strategic. And I've also said it's kind of policy smart, because you can actually design policies to get at the major goals of the Green New Deal. But I also think that what's inspiring about the Green New Deal is that it's very visionary, but without being like totally out there utopian impossible. It's sort of that middle ground of like imaginable, both in the content of what is being proposed and also in the time frame. Like 10 years, that's like a time frame that we can imagine. We know what 10 years feels like. And so it's concrete, but also visionary at the same time. And I love this video, and I know it's not, these copying down these URLs is kind of tricky, but you can just search for it later, not now, but A Message from the Future, which is a video narrated by AOC and designed by, illustrated by wonderful artist Molly Crabapple. And these are just some screenshots from it that is really worth watching. And, sorry, I just lost myself. Okay, the video is really worth watching. And basically what it does is it sort of looks back. Okay, I'm sorry.
No,
it's fine. I can figure it out. Thank you. So what the video does is kind of look back, pretend that we're in 10 years from now. Pretend that it's 2030. And like, what did we achieve? And what the video does is say like, what we actually achieved is not everything. We didn't make the world perfect. That's not possible, right? Those types of utopias, when you read them in science fiction, are never really believable when everything's perfect or everything's terrible. It's sort of like everything's always kind of in between perfect and terrible. We just need to make things a little bit better and get ourselves in the right direction. So if we can sort of imagine in 2030 looking back to what we achieved over the decade of the Green New Deal, we can sort of imagine a world that again, isn't perfect, but is slightly more equal, maybe slightly less economically and racially segregated because we build our communities in different ways. Maybe creates new types of jobs, whether it's in solar energy, like on the bottom there, or whether it's restoring ecosystems, right? Maybe honors people, like indigenous people that have cared for the earth in many ways for millennia. Maybe it involves more bike riding and less car driving, right? So just to sort of imagine what that world would look like and how it can be lower carbon, more socially just, and also more beautiful and pleasurable all at the same time, which I think is not always the way we think about public policy, but the Green New Deal is an invitation to think in that way. I'll leave it there, and looking forward to questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Do I moderate? Should I just take them? You want to do that? Yeah, no, it's on. It's a little wonky. Here we go.
Be loud with them, and I'll let you
Yeah.
pick on it.
And any question, I know, we already have some, but let me just say this really quickly, which is that I love questions. They're literally, if I could do a talk that was just Q&A, I would do it, but no one ever wants that. But anyway, I love questions, and don't feel like anything's a bad question, a stupid question, or like an off-base question, because they're all relevant somehow. I'll make them relevant. Anyway, okay, we had hands up in the front, and then kind of middle back area. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Professor. Thank
Yeah,
you very much
no
for the
problem.
talk. I have two questions. First, what do you think of the role that modern nuclear fission energy has in creating a zero carbon energy source? And what do you think is the role for right to repair legislation, which is getting more popular across the country?
Okay.
For reducing waste and
Great.
also enabling people to have more control and ownership over their own property, which also ties into
Yeah, that words right to repair are actually in my talk script, but I went off script a lot, so I didn't say them out loud. But nuclear was not in my talk, but I'm happy to talk about it. I'm just going to compliment you on two very, sort of like rigorous questions. So thank you for those. What I would say about nuclear, just for people to be aware in the room, and I'm not going to get into a ton of details, but just to know what's sort of, I assume, motivating or sort of in the background to that question is that nuclear is very controversial, meaning there are people that think it's a great solution and people that think it's a not good solution. We already have nuclear energy in the U.S., right? It's not a huge, I'm blanking off the top of my head. Do you happen to know, is it 15 or 20? It's a 20, thank you, overall energy mix, but depending on your energy market within the US, because we have a decentralized energy market, there might be no nuclear or there might be more than that, but on average it's around 20%, right, of the total energy mix of the US. So not insignificant, but not our main source of energy. And why is it controversial? And again, I'm not going to even pretend to be like a nuclear energy expert, but I've read a lot about it, so I'll tell you what people say. It's controversial for a few reasons. One is the waste that it generates is very toxic, and it stays toxic take a very long time, and there aren't always good places to bury it, or to like kick it off to someone else's land or whatever it is. So one is the toxic waste. Two is the extraction that goes into it. It is clean, as in it burns clean, but that doesn't mean it comes from nowhere. We have to actually extract minerals like uranium that have a lot of environmental effects where they're extracted in order to have nuclear power plants. So that's two. The third thing is interesting, something I've read about more recently, which is that some energy experts are concerned about, it's kind of irony of global warming, that the increasing temperatures and the extreme weather events are actually dangerous for nuclear power plants. So there's more risk for nuclear power plants. And we've had a few, breakdowns over the past few years that you may have read about in the news in Japan and elsewhere. So those are the concerns. The benefits, though, and I want to be relatively even-handed, also because my views are reflected in both the pros and the cons. The benefits are that it burns clean and it's carbon-free and it already exists, right? Like we already have this infrastructure, so we should continue to use it. So my thoughts about nuclear are basically that until we have the renewable capacity to replace it, we should keep it going. But I hope that that's a medium-term thing, personally, and we could debate about it more afterwards if you disagree with me. But I don't think it's feasible, in other words, to shut nuclear down today, because if we shut nuclear down, meaning decommissioned it, phased it out, whatever your preferred term is, today, what would we replace it with? Not solar or wind. We would replace it with gas or coal-fired power plants, which are much worse in terms of the actual burning and the creation of emissions. So I don't want to increase carbon emissions, because that's my number one goal. So I think keeping the nuclear that exists is fine. I'm not a big proponent of building out more for two reasons: the environmental reasons I already listed, and economic feasibility reasons. And I know, if you're a nuclear proponent, you probably disagree with this, but from what I've read, it's not economic, meaning there are some economic hurdles to building out a lot more nuclear. It's expensive stuff. Often the state needs to subsidize it. So why not just subsidize stuff that has zero environmental risks, like wind or solar or geothermal? That's my position, which is a sort of middle ground position. I have some environmentalist friends that hate nuclear, and I have some that think it's the solution. And I think we keep it for the next 10, 15, maybe 20 years, but as soon as possible, we swap it out with other things. And then your other question was right to repair, which is something I'm actually kind of really into, and I honestly almost always mention it when I talk, but I forgot to today. But one of the reasons that our lifestyles are so not just carbon intensive but environmentally destructive is that the corporations that we buy stuff from basically tell us that we need a new model every year. If I show you my phone, you will make fun of me. Oh, it's in the other pocket. I have like an iPhone 6 or something, which looks like ancient history to people. It's partly because I have the 6 that's the 5 shape, so it's like the last small one that they made, but it fits in my pocket. I don't know why anyone wants these. Anyways, not important. Point being, all the companies that on Earth tell us that we need to buy a new model every year of everything. Not only that, they make it impossible to repair. Right? So I've lived in a lot of other countries in the world, especially in South America, but also in Europe, and there's actually more of a repair culture, meaning any electronic thing you have, you can go to a place and a guy or a woman or whatever fixes it for you instead of you buying a new one. And the culture of actually respecting your objects and having some ownership and some dignity around them instead of just chucking them every time they malfunction a little bit, it's a very different culture of consumption that's actually better for the environment. And so it's kind of hard to get the private sector to just start behaving differently. So there are laws and proposed legislation out there, and they exist in several countries, that actually make it harder for companies to manufacture things that are inevitably going to break in a year, and also make it harder for them to make it hard for you to fix them, right? And I think those are great. And I'm a huge proponent of not just right to repair, but also thinking about all sorts of creative ways to reuse things, and still, find pleasure. And I'm not an anti-consumption person. I like pretty things. But the question is, do we need a new pretty shiny thing every day? And I don't think we do. Okay, excellent question. So there was something back there. No? Okay, all the way back there. Yes. Bless you.
I'm going to start by doing a shameless self-plug and say I'm part of Sunrise Blister.
Oh.
If you really enjoyed what
Yay.
I had to say tonight, come talk to me after, and we can all get involved and tackle a very new deal here in Blister. But it's less of a question and more something I would be interested in talking about.
Sure.
I got this from your co-author today, Kate Aronoff.
Oh, cool.
And there was a tweet about a bunch of House bills that National Grid, so this gives you a chance.
Oh, yeah. Great.
A bunch of House bills that National Grid proposed, and I'll just read a couple of the descriptions. An act to modernize our natural gas infrastructure, opposed. An act removing barriers to solar for low-income communities, opposed. An act to promote gas safety, opposed. An act to ensure safety and transparency in pipeline repair, opposed. You get what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Thank you. And I like the provocative comment, not question. That's great. I mean, I'm happy to talk about National Grid. They're a terrible actor. I hope that we don't have any National Grid employees or lobbyists in the room, but if so, we can have a debate. But anyway, I don't even know where to begin with this, because one of my passions is like kind of criticizing the shareholder-owned private utilities, because they've done such a disservice. The public ones are not always much better, but I think public utilities are an interesting model to think about for the future. But yeah, I mean, basically National Grid is a shareholder-owned utility. Interesting, why are they called National Grid, which sounds like the name of a public utility, like it sounds like a state-owned thing, but it's not, it's a private thing. They were actually a UK public utility that was privatized during the sort of Thatcher era, which may ring a bell for some people in here. In the late 80s, 90s, there was like a long process, but they were basically privatized, and then they became a shareholder-owned company, and then they invested a lot in utilities, or grids, I should say, in grid ownership in the US, especially New England, right? And especially in the Northeast, I should say. So in New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, they are the people that sort of manage the grid and who you pay your bills to. They don't produce the energy, but they do everything else. They distribute and transmit it. And I'm like trying to think of how much to get into this, because it is something that I've worked on a lot. But basically, I'll be really quick about it. Basically, their business model, privately owned utilities, their business model right now incentivizes them to build a lot of fossil fuel infrastructure, and also to not maintain or care about its impact on our health or our communities. And the reason is because the way that they make money, the only way that they are allowed to actually run a profit, is to charge ratepayers, all of us that, well, maybe not if we live on a dorm, but if you lived off campus, or if you're a professor or staff, like all of us that pay our bills, that money goes to building like a transmission line or something like that. So basically, if they don't make us if they don't convince policymakers that we need to build all of this infrastructure, and right now it's all fossil fuel infrastructure, then they can't make money. It's a very perverse incentive model. It's, a kind of moral hazard situation. In addition, as the speaker from Sunrise kind of just said, they also are very politically influential, because they have monopoly contracts, so they operate these huge areas, and they are very influential unfortunately, on our elected officials, right? So our elected officials will basically rubber stamp anything they do. So, if National Grid says to Rhode Island, like, can we build this substation or do whatever, because that's, again, the only way they can make money, they will probably just say yes. And what does that mean? They raise the rates. They raise the rates. And actually in Rhode Island, I don't know about in Massachusetts, we have some of the highest rates in the country, and a crisis of shutoffs. So every year, Rhode Island's a small state. I'm sure we're aware of that as the larger neighbor. Rhode Island's a small state, and the last time that I saw stats for it a couple of years ago, there were 20,000 households in a year shut off from their energy and gas because they couldn't afford their bills. So people with no heat, no hot water, nothing, because they can't afford their bills. So, and National Grid is like a terrible offender in terms of the environment and has shown zero enthusiasm about renewable energy. So they're awful. That's my National Grid rant. And what do we do instead? There's a few things. We could regulate these corporations better and not have them be so in bed with our politicians. The other thing is we could think about public ownership. We could think about worker and consumer cooperatives and municipal ownership, and there are many of such in the country, like the Tennessee Valley Authority, for example, which dates to the New Deal. But so there are other models of utilities that would be less terrible. Okay, I talked too long about that. Other questions, comments, concerns? Yes, sir.
When I think of the greatest barrier to us making these changes, I think the science is there.
Yeah.
But the political will.
Yeah.
And going back a few years, the 80s and 70s, when President Jimmy Carter wanted to tell people the truth about the energy crisis. They called him a pessimist. Another man stood up who was very good, had a fantastic smile, and he said, "It's morning in America."
Right, Reagan, yes.
And he got elected.
Yes, agree. That is what happened.
But I don't see the public stomach for hard news? Any
But does this look terrible to you? No, I'm really serious. No, but does it look, no, actually, let me just pause for a moment, because that's a great point. And I actually agree with your analysis completely. But I don't agree that it tells us that a Green New Deal is impossible. I agree that a message to Americans of reduce your consumption, and actually think about the moment that Carter was president, sort of moment of the beginnings of what would be like a neoliberal kind of austerity model that Reagan way intensified more than he did. But it was a moment where people were starting to feel the beginnings of the inequality that has gotten much worse today. So the sort of really, if you look at the gap between the richest and the poorest in the US, or between the 1% and just like basically everybody else, it started to widen in the 70s and has gotten worse over time. So I think selling the American public at the moment when we have more social inequality, selling everyday people a sort of climate policy that says you should have less, is not a winning strategy. And it's also, no, people shouldn't have less, because a lot of people actually don't have enough, right? So how do we actually design climate policies that avoid that? And my argument is, I'm curious, I don't want to put people on the spot, because I'm not that type of professor, but part of me wants to say, does anyone want to raise their hand and tell me that this looks like a bad future? No one's going to raise it, because you're all respectful. Anyways, you seem respectful. My students are kind of, similar college, and no one's going to contradict the professor. Maybe other professors will. But I think that, basically, this looks good to most people. It's happy. It's a good message. It's like, yes, I want housing that is beautiful and new and low energy and energy efficient. I want to live in neighborhoods that are less deeply segregated. I want good union jobs that pay $15 an hour or more. And that's what the Green New Deal is selling. And it's selling it in a way where each of those are thought through in terms of how they mitigate emissions and also adapt to already existing climate change. And it's exactly for the reasons you just said that I think the Green New Deal is popular and a carbon tax isn't. Even if we get into the policy weeds, which I'm happy to do a little more so, a carbon tax might be a better designed carbon tax than the one that Macron implemented, might be part of a Green New Deal. But it's certainly not what you lead with. Maybe it's the fifth policy you try to enact, right? Maybe the first one is green public housing and mass transit, and people are on board for that, and it generates those constituencies, and then they're not feeling that pressure of paycheck to paycheck austerity, and then they're more open to things that maybe sound a little scarier, or maybe sound like they would change their consumption habits a little more. You don't start with banning red meat. Maybe that's the 30th thing we do. I'm not saying we have to do that. We could just probably eat a lot less of it and that would be okay, right? But you never start with austerity, like veganism, and like don't consume as much in the United States or in any country for that matter. And I think people have good reason to be skeptical of that, but I think this addresses that. I don't know if I'm convincing you though.
No, but
I'm not. Okay. Well, maybe I've convinced someone else. I'm joking. But I think your concern is valid, which is actually why I think this is good policy. Because I think you can do a morning in America with this. And I think Carter's approach was wrong. Really. I think it was bad messaging. It wasn't, and it was bad policy. Like, it wasn't the way to actually deal with it. But, information was limited at the time as well. Yeah.
Just follow up the fellow here from the
Yeah.
Sunrise Movement. I'm the chapter leader of Citizens Climate Lobby here in Worcester.
Oh, cool.
And it features a kind of carbon tax that's called revenue neutral. We call it carbon dividend. So you pay according to how much carbon you use, but everybody gets back the same amount. So low carbon users make out very well under this, and high carbon users, who are basically rich people, have wonderful incentive to use less carbon.
Yeah, no, I think that you can add, and that's why I said a well-designed carbon tax, right? Because I think that's one idea. There's other ideas I like, and I won't bore people less interested in the policy weeds with them. But I do think there are ways to design carbon tax that sound better. Maybe even the word tax could go, and we could do something else, but you could just call it the carbon dividend and just focus on that part. But anyway, I think there are ways to design them that they're not only more politically popular, but more equitable, right? Because the Macron one was very unequitable in the way it was implemented, and people understood that smartly and reacted against it. Other questions or thoughts? Yes, please. Of course.
If you could talk about the upcoming election. So
Yes.
The Democratic candidates in their primary all talk about a Green New Deal, but they realistically have different visions of it.
Very good, yeah. Yeah.
So first of all, which you think are effective and possible, and then also if Trump is incumbent, what next?
Okay, great question, and something another thing that was literally on my talk, but I, again, went off script a little bit, so I didn't touch every bullet point. But yeah, the Democratic election, I want to just frame this by saying, I have my own opinions, and they are very easy to find out on Twitter, so you can go there if you want, and I'm not shy about them, so I'll share my personal opinions and preferences in a moment, but I want to start with a more sort of just overall and objective statement, which is I think that, there's a lot to be depressed about. However, this is the first time that we're really seeing a race, including in the Democratic Party, where climate is such a major issue. And just the fact that you can even say each candidate, I'm kind of quoting you, each candidate has a climate plan. They're different, but each one has one, right? That wasn't the case. I don't even remember if there was literally a question about climate change in 2016. And you cannot convince anyone in this room that climate change wasn't an issue in 2016. But it wasn't, politicians were not being forced to talk about it by groups like the Sunrise, I think Sunrise person went away. But anyway, Sunrise person and local civic climate action person. Anyway, there's a lot of movements that are forcing politicians to talk about it, not just lip service though, you go to their websites and there's plans, right? And to better and worse, but at least they exist. Okay, so that's just my plug for, we're all doing slightly better. There's better and worse. So I think that, we may forget about him now because every day feels like a year at this moment in politics, but eons ago, there was Jay Inslee in the race, right? He didn't register 1%, but I think that he had a good impact because he, as a politician, and as an expert, had very detailed knowledge and experience with climate policy, and then he put together a very good plan, which I overall agree with. I would have to get really nitpicky to tell you things I didn't like about it. I didn't think it was quite comprehensive enough in terms of there were some areas like housing and transit that could have been even more detailed, but overall, it was very good. So that was the Inslee plan. And the Inslee plan was then taken up by Elizabeth Warren, and she added some other things to it as well. So those are two good plans. Bernie Sanders' plan, which I was going to talk about more, but again, forgot to, has the highest price tag of anyone's plan. It's $16 trillion, but we know from what I've already said that I think actually that's a good thing, not a bad thing. The amount of money is good because it indicates the seriousness and the scope and the comprehensiveness of it. And so I like his plan a lot, but I also like Inslee's. So those are my thoughts. I don't think any of the other candidates personally, again, talking my own politics, have plans that are as good as those, but I'm glad that everyone has a plan. But what I'm skeptical of, and I'll just say one other, I'm not going to be negative right now, but I'll just say what I'm skeptical of is any candidate who thinks things like the following, like natural gas is clean or a bridge fuel. I'm not going to name names, but there's a couple people up there that think that, and it is bonkers because it's not. I mean, the New York Times had an amazing investigation recently that I highly, especially if you're a visual learner, really, really recommend because it has some great graphics of methane emissions from natural gas, fracking, not just the fracking, not just the moment where they're hydraulically moving the earth around, but the whole distribution and consumption and burning of it. Methane is just leaking everywhere. And what's the deal with methane? It heats up the atmosphere much faster than carbon does. And in fact, some scientists think that the explosion in fracking in the US and in some other place in Canada, but really in the US, is part of what explains an unexplained rapid increase in global temperatures that scientists did not know how to explain. And so anyone that's it's a bridge fuel, be skeptical. I mean, at least be on notice about it. The rest of their plan could be okay, but that I don't agree with. But I think basically you're looking for scale, scope, and comprehensiveness. And I personally, I'm a partisan. I like Sanders' plan the best, but I also think Inslee's and Warren's plans are very good on that same count. Did that answer the question well enough? Great. Any other questions, comments, feedback, criticisms? No. Okay. Wow. Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much.